Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Maria Konnikova is a psychologist and author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, Confidence Game and Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. She is a regularly contributing writer for The New Yorker, whose writing has won numerous awards, including the 2019 Excellence in Science Journalism Award from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. Maria's writing has been featured in Best American Science and Nature Writing and has been translated in over 20 languages. Maria also hosts the podcast The Grift from Panoply Media, a show that explores con artists and the lives they ruin, and is currently a visiting fellow at NYU School of Journalism. Her new book, The Biggest Bluff, will be out from Penguin Press in the next few weeks. And while researching The Biggest Bluff, Maria became an international poker champion and the winner of over $300,000 in tournament earnings, and inadvertently turned into a professional poker player. So listeners, what you may be wondering, what did you just say? How do this, and this comes from a cover of the book, how do the skills learned at the poker table translate to the skills required to live a better, more thoughtful, and ultimately successful life? The Biggest Bluff isn't about how to play poker. It's about how to play the world. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick.
And congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Interesting time to have a book release. I hope everything's going well. a lot of these interviews.
One of the things that poker has taught me is that you have no idea what's coming next, and there's only so much you can control, and you don't know what the next card you will be dealt is. So that's what we're dealing with right now.
Absolutely. So I am a huge Kenny Rogers fan. And growing up, I, of course, listened to The Gambler. And for the listeners who don't... No, don't worry. I will also not sing it. I will just quote it in speech. So the chorus, of course, is you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Your new book is one big, beautiful sort of extended chorus of Rogers' song and much more than that. And I heard you say in a talk, and this is a quote, maybe once upon a time I thought this relationship was pocket aces, but right now it's 7 deuce offsuit, so you gotta let it go. Now, if listeners, I love that, by the way. I think that should be, move aside Kenny Rogers. There's a new song in town. And if any of my listeners have played poker, they'll of course get what you're saying there. But for those who don't, or who know very little, let's say, can you just give us a bit of an introduction of how this all happened? What was your journey into this world and how all the pieces came together?
Absolutely. So as you briefly mentioned, this was new to me. I was a writer and never had any interest in poker, or especially in professional poker. I mean, I had no idea what that even entailed. I'd never played cards. I was not a games player ever in my life. And I came to this from a very different angle. I wanted to write a book about luck, about the role that chance plays in our lives, about learning to tell the difference about the things we can control and the things we can't control. And I got to poker while reading John von Neumann's Theory of Games, which is the foundational text of game theory. And it turns out that game theory comes from poker. And von Neumann, who was one of the great minds of the 20th century, believed that in poker you had the key to strategic decision making, because poker, he felt, was the perfect metaphor for life, in the sense that it's a game of incomplete information. There's information that I know, there's information that you know, there's information we know in common, but nobody knows everything. It's not like chess, which is a game of perfect information. You see the entire board, and theoretically the correct move is available to you, and it can be calculated, and if you have enough computing power, you can solve it. Poker isn't like that. And life isn't like that because of the hidden information, because of the personal, because of the interplay then between what you know and what I know and what I think you know and what you think I know. It becomes a much more human game. It becomes much more interactive. It becomes much more reactive. And when I was reading all of this, I thought, this is really interesting. Let me learn about poker. This seems like something worthwhile. And as I started reading about it, I thought, this is a really good way into this topic. Why don't I actually learn how to play? Why don't I find someone to teach me and go from zero, from never having played, to playing, and use that journey as a metaphor for life, as a way of exploring these themes of chance, of luck in our lives. And that's how the journey began, and I obviously had no idea where it would end up taking me.
And here you are. Championship poker player. That is such an interesting story. I mean, and it would be interesting if you were any person, but you're a trained psychologist and behavioral scientist as well. And if I'm not mistaken, it was sort of your PhD dissertation, or your work that you did in your PhD, was like kind of loosely or more directly connected to decision making in poker, and broadly decision making under uncertainty. Is that right?
It had nothing to do with poker, but it had to do with risky decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. I actually had people play stock market games. So it's very relevant, and the skills that I learned there, kind of the information I gleaned, the psychological insights are incredibly applicable to poker, but I didn't know enough to use poker in my research, because I had no idea basically what poker was at the time. But yes, I studied how we make decisions, how we make risky decisions, how we evaluate risk, how we learn when you're in a stochastic environment, an environment where there are elements outside of your control, and an environment that's changing. And I also manipulated stress and emotion, made it difficult, forced people to make decisions quickly under time pressure, did all sorts of mean things to them, and then of course found them being done to me when I started playing poker, and I did not like it one bit.
Poker karma. Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of grad school, was doing some mean things to my participants. It wasn't that mean. So back to poker as the game of choice. I find that curious. I find that really interesting. And you pitted it against chess as another alternative. But as you mentioned, it is incomplete information, and it's much at poker that is, and it's much more closer to the sort of the day-to-day decisions, both big and small, that we make as humans. But it's interesting, just as the sort of the stereotypes that get that accompany these different games. So chess is seen as this sort of high-level erudite strategy, and also the other thing when I think was the Chinese game Go, I know a lot of people talk about. Whereas poker, and this might just be my own bias, my own sort of blind spot, poker is kind of like this raw, it's harsher, it's kind of got this connotation of gambling and making money. Why do you think that's the case, when in fact there's so much truth to what underlies it all?
Yeah, I don't think it's your perception at all. I think that this is just the general perception in the world. This is how people see poker, and I think it's the case for a few reasons. I think historically, it's just been misperceived, because the way that it's been portrayed in popular culture and media is, these guys with fat cigars and Stetsons and backlit rooms, in shady taverns and casinos and all these things. And yeah, once upon a time, I guess it was like that back in the Wild West. But so were a lot of things, and that's really not the game. But I think that because money is involved, because betting is involved, because it's played in casinos historically, it's people just conflate it with casino games. They think, oh, it's gambling. And one of the things that I hope to show in my book is that actually poker is not gambling. So when people say, oh, you're a gambler, I say, no, actually I'm not. I'm just a poker player. I don't gamble. I don't like gambling. I hate casinos. I don't like any casino games because they're all games of luck. And poker ultimately is a game of skill. And the way that you can very easily show that is that you can win with the worst hand and you can lose with the best hand. So it just shows you that skill is a very big part of it. In fact, there was a study that was done on online poker, and the researcher Ingo Fiedler found that in online poker, about 12% of hands that went to showdown were won. 12% of hands were won by the actual best hand. So that means
12%?
that 12%, that means that 88% of the time it was not the best hand that won. That just goes to show you how much skill there is in the game and how much of it is who's the better player. And so I actually think that you learn so many more skills that are translatable to so many areas of life than something like chess. But historically, chess is the good girls' sport. Good chess
the chess
is the
club.
thing that you do. Exactly. Chess is what nice Russian Jewish girls do, which is what I am. Poker is not. And I think that it's the money, I think it's the gambling, I think it's the casinos, and I think it's just such a shame because, by the way, I think chess is a beautiful, wonderful game. I think chess should be taught as well, but I don't think that it's mutually exclusive. I think that poker teaches you very different skills that are very transferable to life. And I think that all kids should learn both.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an interesting just sort of psychological and historical analysis of these two games, and for whatever historical accidents and arbitrary sets of things that happened in the past, we have these associations of what those games mean and what connotations they bring out. It's really interesting. I've never thought of that. And it reminds me, you were talking about that study. There was another one that came across a little while ago. I think it was a researchers team at MIT. You might have heard of it. So what they did was they were sort of, it was all in the context of fantasy sports and the legislation, and I think it was in the U.S. of whether to make it legal versus illegal. And I guess part of the criteria is it more chance than skill? And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Of course, there's sort of this dimension or this gradient along which they sit. And I think they took a series of fantasies. They took real sports, like the extent to which it's based on luck, chance, or skill in real sports, like basketball, hockey, baseball, and then also fantasy sports, then flipping a coin and stock market trading. And then they basically had this algorithm and fancy modeling to score it between 0 and 1. 0 being absolute pure luck, i.e. the coin flipping, so that was that, and then 1 being pure skill. And that was it. The highest one they found was cycling, was the sort of the sport, whether it was fantasy or the real sport, participating in the real sport, required the most skill. Coin flipping was the least amount of skill or the most amount of luck. And then the fantasy sports were sort of all in between. But then that got me thinking as I was preparing for our chat, where do you think poker would sit in between that 0 and 1 point?
It's very difficult to tell you in the abstract because it's a different answer depending on the time horizon that we are considering. So in the short term, anyone can win because in the short term, it's actually chance is a very big factor. So one hand of poker, if we play one hand, anyone can win. Someone who's never played before can win. Because you just might get dealt pocket aces and then the flop comes ace deuce and you have quads and voila, you won. And that requires no skill. You just got the best hand that you could have possibly gotten. But if you look at 10 hands, chances are I'm gonna start winning. If we look at 100 hands and you've never played and I'm a good player, and by the way, by I just mean one is a good player. As the number increases, the amount of skill goes up. And as we get to 100 hands, 1,000 hands, as 10,000 hands, 100,000 hands, all of a sudden it's far more skill. The skilled player is going to be winning. And I think the skilled player is going to have a massive edge and is going to come out with a lot more money. It just depends on the time horizon because variance doesn't care, about whether you're better or not in the short term. Variance is just going to be like it will be, and variance doesn't look like our idea of it. 50% doesn't actually look like, okay, it's going to be heads one time, it's going to be tails the next time. right? You could have 10 heads in a row, and that doesn't mean that you have a crooked coin. It just means that you're in a weird part of the distribution. But in order to see past that, but if you flip a coin 100 times, then you'll start seeing closer to 50-50. If you flip it 1,000 times, even closer, 10,000 times, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that your skill edge is going to start coming out the longer you play. And that's I think that's a very important determination. But also, in terms of the activities that you mentioned, I think that poker is far more skill-based than fantasy sports, and I think it's more skill-based than trading. And I actually cite some studies, including some work by Daniel Kahneman in my book, where he actually compares stocks and stock traders and hedge fund performance to poker, and he finds that they're actually gamblers as opposed to poker players, that poker players are much more skill-based, and that they look much more like they're doing slots in a casino.
Yes, and I'm glad you pointed that out, that research. In the MIT one, they found that of the 10 behaviors that they examined, the lowest on that 0 to 1 was coin flipping, as I said, and then the second lowest was stock market trading. So just goes to show, right? And yet we have a whole
and that's
capitalistic
a legitimate
system.
Profession, right?
Yes, yeah, and not just legitimate, seen as like the status that comes with being a broker and a person on this who plays the stock market. Interesting. So let's go to your first few games, or maybe your first few tournaments, if that's how it happened. And what was it like? If you could just sort of bring us back into that time. What were your, speaking of emotions, like what were your emotions like?
It was incredibly overwhelming and scary. And I remember my first ever tournament, which I didn't realize I was going to be playing, was a charity event where Eric made me think that I was just going to be watching him, and then kind of it sprung it on me about 5 minutes before cards were in the air that I was actually to be playing, because he didn't want me to be nervous ahead of time, but he just succeeded in making me basically want to throw up.
Tough love from a mentor.
Exactly. So, it was very scary at first, and so many things were happening, and I just felt completely like a fish out of water, which is a good metaphor to use here, because I was definitely a fish, and fish is the poker term for a bad player who will give you a lot of money. So I was definitely a fish at the time. And I had played online before, but I'd never played live. And over the course of the night, it started getting better. I started feeling better. I started being happier. I started having fun and really enjoying it. And then, of course, I got overconfident and busted. And that's all she wrote. My first real tournament, quote unquote, because it was for real money, in Las Vegas, I first got lost in the casino, which wasn't a very good start. Then didn't know I needed a player's card, so then got lost again as I went to get the player's card, and was almost late, which made me really scared, because I didn't realize at the time that people can be late, that you can late reg, that all this stuff existed. I thought I had to be there right at the beginning. And for a very long time I was always petrified. Even after I knew that, I was the one who was always kind of first in my seat in tournaments for a long time. I'm not anymore. Now I like to sleep, but back then I would always be there right at the beginning, and I was really scared as well, and I felt really out of place. I was the only female, and this was at the Golden Nugget, and it was a very small buy-in tournament. I don't remember what it was, $35, something like that. And so a lot of tourists, not a lot of serious players, although there was one who I write about in the book who ended up being an angle shooter, and ended up seeing him around the daily tournaments in Vegas many times after that, but would obviously avoid anything in which he was playing, because that's how he made his living, was fleecing tourists and doing and basically cheating. So I was not a fan of his, but I met him for the first time in my first ever tournament. And it was, all of these were very emotional experiences because I just, there was so much going on and I was just such a novice and there were so many things to keep in mind. And I was supposed to be writing down hands for Eric, but I couldn't keep track of everything. And it was just overwhelming because he wanted me to look at too many things. I can't even figure out, what to do with my cards. How am I supposed to know, what their stack sizes are and how aggressive they're being and all these things. And then over time, obviously that changed. And that's the kind of your journey from novice to gaining a little bit more proficiency. But those early tournaments were all very high emotion, very high stress, very stomach turning, so to speak. And honestly, that never completely goes away. For every big tournament, I always get nervous at the beginning when I'm just sitting down. I always have kind of butterflies in my stomach. And it's true not just of poker tournaments. That happens to me before public speaking. It happens to me before almost anything major. And it's just anticipatory. And, it's not necessarily high anxiety, but it's something that for me has never gone away.
And anxiety can be a good thing. We know that. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the researcher. But there's a famous TED Talk, and she wrote a book. Kenny McGonigal. Is it not Carrie? Is it Carrie McGonigal? Anyway, so she draws on this research. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I do. Yes, I don't.
So she draws on. Yeah. I think I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, she draws on this research showing that anxiety can actually. Yeah.
I think it's Jane McGonigal.
Yeah, maybe that's it. I will find the right one.
I don't know if that's the. Yeah, I guess she also did a talk about stress. I've seen her talks about gaming because she's a video game designer.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, so yeah, I know she. I don't think she's the lead researcher, but she draws on those who found in this research that anxiety can actually boost our performance, but and does these really elegant manipulations in lab, again stressing these undergraduate participants out, and just putting the physiological experience that we all know what that feels like. The butterflies, the sweaty palms, all that physiological arousal that's happening. But in that manipulation, of course, just giving it a new framing, as this is sort of something that can be exciting. This is something that actually can boost your performance and get you to perform optimally, as opposed to something that is like, oh God, I'm feeling this way now. It's crippling me. And I wonder if that's, and maybe you could, of course, comment on that, is because you said you have the same anxiety. So if you, let's say, imagine we could hook you up to some sort of, peripheral psychophysiological device, and we can measure your skin sweating and your heart rate and all those things. We would still see that, I guess, but your psychology is interpreting it in probably a different way. Yeah.
Probably. And I do think that, I think there's so many variables here. I do think that a little bit of stress goes a long way. and I do think that it can enhance your performance. And yeah, I do think that over time, probably your brain is going to interpret it differently. But yeah, so I think all of those things are true, but I think that there's so much complexity. There's just so much individual difference probably in how you're interpreting it and what exactly it means and how nervous you really are as you personally. And I don't even know if we have conscious access to that necessarily. We have ways of mental framing. We have ways of dealing with it. And I talk myself down all the time. I say, you know what you're doing. You've done this before. You'll be fine. I give myself like these inner pep talks because it doesn't go away otherwise. And it's funny. It's funny to observe myself from the outside.
And speaking of individual differences, I've always wondered this, like before any of my training when I played poker, and I'm a terrible poker player. I'm just going to say this right off the bat. I'm a decent behavioral scientist and psychologist, but I'm a really bad poker player, and my friends can attest to that. We set up this thing in the middle of the pandemic to hang out and to play online poker, and I don't even want to know how much I've lost over the last 2 months, and all my friends have taken my money because I'm so bad. But anyway, thinking of individual differences, I'm wondering, like, what are those personality predictors which lead a person to be a good or a bad poker player? Is it is IQ or fluid intelligence associated with it? Is emotional thinking? Yeah. What is it that's really driving it? If we know.
I don't think we know, and I think it's different for different people. And I also, I want to be very careful about that. I did do my dissertation with Walter Mischel, so I'm not a fan of personality predictions. And I'm all about situational behavioral signature awareness. I'm not a fan of the big five. I don't go in that direction. So, and I'm not a fan of IQ. I think that that's a very, very flawed predictor. So I don't actually use any of those, and I am very skeptical of a lot of that research. But that's my training, that's my background. I know that I have a bias in that direction, but I think that poker has really actually affirmed it because it shows that everything is situationally dependent. You have people who are incredibly confident and aggressive and bullies in most situation, and then if you start fighting back and you start actually taking their chips, they can change completely, and when they're on the defensive, they're suddenly a different person. There are people who are the opposite, who are actually not aggressive at all, and all of a sudden they can become aggressive when put in a certain situation. What poker is great at doing is just crafting all of these situations that you can really see someone's behavioral signature, which I think is much more powerful than personality, come out, because then you start seeing, this person behaves like this when this happens. They behave like this when that happens. And those things can be polar opposites. I do an analysis of my own behavior at some point, showing that I'm very risk-seeking in certain situations and incredibly risk-averse in others. So I don't actually I can't give myself a score on risk-seeking behavior because it really depends on where you put me. And someone who plays poker with me for a day during a tournament is going to see that and is actually going to know me much better than somebody who's known me for a long time but has never seen that full array of situations, has never seen me under pressure in just the right way. So I think poker is actually a really interesting laboratory for doing that sort of behavioral assessment. So insofar, though, as we have something that will make someone good at poker, I think it's things like, willingness to learn, things like intellectual humility, things like, being able to take feedback, being attentive and mindful and actually paying attention to people and being able to kind of be in tune with what they're doing. I think those types of things are very helpful. Your emotional abilities, your self-control abilities are also incredibly helpful because, if you can't control your emotions, if you don't know how to tamper yourself down, because you will get tilted, which is the poker term for, getting emotionally involved in something, no matter who you are. I mean, unless you're a psychopath, you will get tilted when playing at some point. And if you lack the ability, the introspection, and the kind of metacognitive awareness, if you aren't able to see that, you're going to have a problem. So I think the ability to actually analyze yourself in the moment, say, okay, I'm angry, I'm this, I'm that, here's why, let me distance myself from it, here's how I calm myself down, here's how I remove that from my decision process. Those types of things are incredibly helpful, but those types of things can be taught. I mean, those are skills that are learned. Some people have it, naturally, but I think that those are the types of things that will help you and that, I can teach you, or anyone can teach you if they know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. I'm very glad you brought up Michel's behavioral signatures and the CAPS model. So not to go into it, but I will really highly suggest readers.
I go into it in the book, so.
Good, perfect. I'm going to really recommend listeners check that part out and check out the research, the sort of the seminal research that was done, because it's one of my favorite sort of parts of social psychology, and it's just funny how most people sort of think of him in the early work with the delayed gratification and of course the marshmallow stuff, but when in fact I think this is so much better, just so much more nuanced. He thought
that too. So when he died, I wrote his obituary for the New Yorker. Mm-hmm. And I'd had a chance to interview him, multiple times. Obviously, he was someone who wasn't just my advisor, but became a a friend until his death, someone I stayed in very close touch with. And he was most proud of the CAPS model. He that's what he wanted to be remembered for.
Wonderful. That's great. So going back to what you said with the pocket aces, you think your relationship or friendship is pocket aces when it may just be offsuit seven deuce. So taking all of these insights and learnings in the game of playing the game of poker, and applying it to real world scenarios, how do you do that, or how do you recommend for yourself, obviously, because this is very much like a memoir based book, but how do you also recommend other people do that? And if you can, cite, I guess there's certain biases or heuristics like sunk cost here, which play a part. So for listeners, how would you sort of extrapolate that out to real life scenario?
Absolutely. Well, that was, that talk was, I'm not sure which talk I said that in, but that is kind of the extrapolation. So what poker has taught me is a lot of the biases that I've studied in psychology, like the sunk cost fallacy. And for listeners who don't know, the sunk cost fallacy is basically looking at things that you've already spent at sunk costs at the past, and because of that, not changing your behavior, using that as kind of a way of saying, oh, well, I've already invested this much, I'm going to have to keep investing. And this can be financial, an actual sunk cost, where investors will just hold on to their losses because they don't want to crystallize them, and so they say, well, I've already spent this much, might as well keep going. It goes on a company level when companies keep investing in technology, even when someone says, oh, hey, a competitor already has something better. They say, well, let's just finish this. We've already invested millions in it. Whereas you should really say, okay, I can't change that, but why put good money after bad? And it works on an emotional level, relationships that keep going because of inertia, because you've already, spent so much time in something, et cetera, et cetera. And it's something that I think permeates everyone's life. I mean, sunk costs are incredibly difficult to fight, just like almost all of these decision biases. I mean, Danny Kahneman, who's studied them his whole life, still experiences them and says that. Says, I still have all these biases that I write about. Poker is actually a way of debiasing yourself in a lot of respects. Not all, obviously, it's not perfect, it's a game. But there are a lot of ways in which it does it. And the thing that you're specifically referring to, sunk costs, this was something that I really learned in poker. When you have an amazing hand, so pocket aces are the best hand you can possibly be dealt before the flop. Well, the value of your hand is only as good as the information you have at that moment. Before the flop, it's the absolute best hand. Now imagine that the board comes, 6, 7, 8, all hearts, and you have black aces. All of a sudden, you don't need to know anything about poker to understand this example. All of a sudden, your hand means nothing. Its value goes to not zero, but almost zero, especially if people start betting, because your hand is so removed from that board. It doesn't interact with it in any way. And chances are people who had hands that were much worse than yours to begin with might now have very strong hands. So the environment has changed significantly. A lot of players are just unable to let go of the aces because they think, oh, I have aces. This is so wonderful. I can't fold. I have the best hand possible. Your best hand now might as well be garbage. So 7 deuce is the worst hand that you can be dealt. So your aces have now turned to 7 deuce, except 7 deuce would actually be a much stronger hand on that board because you have a straight draw. And you actually have something, whereas aces are not. So all of a sudden your 7 deuce is actually stronger than your aces.
Yeah.
And I've seen so many times, especially players who are very careful, who are very conservative, who like to take their time. So often, they just can't find the fold. And in poker, such an important lesson, and it's one you feel in your pocketbook, so you really need to learn it quickly, is you need to be able to find the fold. And I've learned that, once you're able to find it in poker, it actually becomes easier to analyze it and to do that in life. You start seeing these analogies, you start seeing how it plays out, and you start being able to let go in a much better way. And I can go on and on. There's so many examples of how kind of poker can really debias you with in a lot of ways. But this is just one, I think, very good example of how you can take what you've learned at the table and apply it to everyday life. Learn
Wonderful.
to fold your aces.
Yes, yes. And I mean, it's not just an analogy. It's almost like it is probably a same sort of psychology or a same psychological state when you're seeing the flop or pondering decisions of friendships and relationships. So it's a wonderful parallel. And I do highly recommend the book for everyone listening. It's amazing. And I suspect that if there's any academics who actually find your work, and there's going to be a lot who read it, I think poker is going to be all of a sudden a very popular manipulation in the lab, where they're probably just sitting participants up with the. Because why not? It's so easy, right?
Absolutely.
Well, Maria, it's been a pleasure, and after talking to you and reading the book, I am committing myself to becoming a better poker player, at least just a little bit. Thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, I hope it helps.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.